The Council of Nicaea is often remembered as a great spiritual gathering where early Christians came together to settle their theological differences and agree on the truth of their faith. That is the story usually told. But when you strip away the layers of pious storytelling, what you find is less about divine guidance and more about politics, control, and power. The meeting in Nicaea in the year 325 was not a gathering of men inspired by God, but a carefully orchestrated political strategy by the Roman Emperor Constantine, a ruler who understood that religion was one of the most effective tools for unifying an empire that was on the brink of fragmentation. To understand why Constantine called the council, you have to remember what the Roman world looked like in the early 4th century. The empire was vast, stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It was also divided, exhausted by decades of civil wars, invasions, and economic decline. Constantine himself had only recently secured power after years of bloody conflict against rival emperors. He needed stability, and he needed it fast. Religion was the obvious place to turn. At the time, Christianity was growing rapidly, but it was not unified. It was a patchwork of rival groups, each with their own ideas about who Jesus was, what his teachings meant, and how people should worship. That diversity was a problem for a ruler like Constantine. A fractured religion could never provide the political glue he needed. So the emperor stepped in, not to find truth, but to create order. The main controversy that pushed Constantine to act was the dispute between Arius, a priest from Alexandria, and his opponents led by Athanasius. Arius argued that Jesus, while divine in some sense, was not equal to God the Father. For him, Christ was a created being, exalted above humans but still subordinate to God. His opponents rejected this idea, insisting that Jesus was fully divine, eternal, and equal to the Father. To us today, this might sound like an abstract debate about words, but in the 4th century, it was explosive. Entire congregations were divided. Bishops denounced each other, and riots broke out in cities. The theological fight was tearing communities apart, and Constantine realized it could also tear his empire apart. The council was his solution, a political summit disguised as a religious gathering. What makes the Council of Nicaea so significant is not that it produced a creed, but that it revealed how religion can be molded by political needs. Constantine did not care which side was right. He was not interested in the subtleties of theology. What he wanted was consensus, because consensus meant unity, and unity meant stability. The bishops who attended the council were not free to simply debate truth. They were operating under the shadow of imperial authority. Constantine presided over the meeting like a judge, encouraging compromise, but making it clear that endless debate would not be tolerated. In the end, the council condemned Arius and declared that Jesus was of the same substance as the Father, a phrase that would become central to Orthodox Christianity. But the decision was not the result of divine inspiration. It was the outcome of political pressure, imperial influence, and the fear of being on the wrong side of the emperor. When you look closely, the creed that emerged from Nicaea reflects less about what early Christians naturally believed and more about what Constantine needed them to believe. By declaring Jesus fully divine and equal to God, the council eliminated ambiguity. It gave the empire a clear and simple doctrine around which to rally. Ambiguity breeds division, but a sharp definition allows the state to enforce loyalty. From that point forward, to question the creed was not just to question theology, it was to defy the emperor's chosen settlement. Heresy became not only a religious error, but also a political crime. That blending of religion and state power was one of the most lasting legacies of Nicaea, and it set the stage for centuries of persecution, control, and suppression of dissent. One of the striking things about the Council of Nicaea is how little it had to do with faith as people actually lived it. Ordinary Christians at the time did not sit around debating Greek philosophical terms about substance and essence. Most of them were struggling to survive in a harsh world of famine, disease, and political upheaval. The council was not about their concerns. It was about the concerns of elites, bishops seeking influence, and an emperor seeking stability. This tells us something crucial about the history of religion. Doctrines are often shaped not by the needs of ordinary people, but by the interests of those in power. The Creed was not a grassroots expression of faith. It was a top-down decree imposed on communities that often had very different beliefs and practices. It is also important to see how much was excluded at Nicaea. Early Christianity was diverse. Some groups saw Jesus primarily as a human prophet, others as a mystical revealer, and still others as a divine being who only appeared human. There were gospels circulating that told very different stories about him. But at Nicaea, all of that diversity was flattened. The Creed drew a line between orthodoxy and heresy, and once that line was drawn, everything outside of it was condemned. Texts that did not fit were suppressed. Teachers who did not conform were marginalized or persecuted. A religion that had once thrived on diversity and debate was narrowed down to a rigid formula, not because that formula was true, but because it was useful to the state. If you trace the aftermath of Nicaea, you see how fragile this settlement really was. The debates did not end. In fact, they raged on for decades, with emperors and bishops continually revisiting the question of Christ's nature. Arius was exiled, then recalled, then condemned again. Even Constantine himself wavered and, according to some sources, was baptized on his deathbed by a bishop sympathetic to the Arian position. That inconsistency shows that the council did not really resolve the theological issue. What it did was establish the principle that theology could be decided by imperial decree. The precedent was set. The emperor had the right to convene councils, dictate outcomes, and enforce orthodoxy. That blending of throne and altar would dominate Christian history for more than 1,000 years. What gets lost in the traditional telling is that Nicaea was less about discovering eternal truth than about building an institution. Before the council, Christianity was a movement with many voices. After the council, it became an institution with one official voice, backed by state power. That shift is why Nicaea matters. It marks the moment when the religion was re-engineered to serve political ends. The Creed was not just a statement of belief. It was a tool of governance. By forcing bishops to sign it, Constantine turned religion into a mechanism for testing loyalty. Those who signed were allies of the state. Those who refused were enemies. Faith was transformed into a political boundary, and that transformation would have consequences far beyond Constantine's lifetime. Even the setting of the council tells us something. Nicaea was not chosen for spiritual reasons. It was chosen because it was convenient for the emperor. It was close to Constantinople, his new capital, and it allowed him to oversee the proceedings without traveling far. The bishops were housed at imperial expense, dined at imperial banquets, and deliberated under the emperor's watchful eye. This was not a free council of equals. It was a gathering staged and managed by the state. Every detail reinforced the message. Christianity was no longer an underground movement persecuted by Rome. It was now under the wing of imperial power, and that power had the final say. The irony is that Constantine himself was never a deeply committed Christian. He continued to honor pagan rituals throughout his life. He kept the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. He minted coins with the image of the sun god Sol Invictus, even after convening the council. His use of Christianity was pragmatic, not devout. He saw in the religion a way to consolidate his rule, not a path to personal salvation. That makes the Council of Nicaea even more revealing. The man who dictated the direction of Christian doctrine was not acting out of faith, but out of political calculation. And yet, his decisions shaped the core beliefs of billions of people for centuries to come. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the nature of God and Christ was decided in a political council overseen by an emperor who was not fully committed to the faith, what does that say about the authenticity of those beliefs? If eternal truths were determined by the needs of empire, can they really be eternal truths at all? The Creed of Nicaea is recited in churches to this day, as if it came directly from divine revelation. But in reality, it came from a council room filled with political maneuvering, fear of division, and the heavy hand of imperial authority. That gap between the story told and the reality behind it is one of the most striking features of religious history. The council also reveals how easily religious debates become tools for personal ambition. The bishops who attended were not neutral thinkers searching for truth. They were men deeply embedded in networks of rivalry, patronage, and ambition. Many of them saw the council as a chance to gain influence in the new imperial church. Supporting the winning side meant access to imperial favor, financial support, and prestige. Opposing it meant exile, disgrace, or worse. That atmosphere shaped every decision. The language chosen for the creed was not only about theology, but about excluding rivals and securing advantage. The famous phrase, "of the same substance," was carefully selected because it put Arius and his supporters outside the boundary of orthodoxy. It was a political weapon disguised as a theological statement. When you study the records of the council, you notice how much the debates relied on philosophical jargon borrowed from Greek thought. Words like essence and substance were not terms Jesus ever used. They were not part of the vocabulary of fishermen, farmers, or ordinary people. They were the language of philosophers and elites. This reveals another layer of the council's politics. It turned a popular movement rooted in simple stories and ethical teachings into a religion of complex abstractions that only specialists could interpret. That shift increased the power of bishops and theologians. Ordinary believers became dependent on elites to tell them what to believe. Religion became less about lived experience and more about adherence to formulas crafted by councils under imperial oversight. The political consequences of Nicaea were immediate. Arius and a handful of bishops who refused to sign the creed were exiled. Their writings were ordered to be burned. This was the beginning of a pattern. Disagreement was not tolerated, and diversity of belief was treated as dangerous. By criminalizing theological dissent, Constantine made the church into an arm of imperial policy. The same mechanisms that had been used to suppress political opponents were now applied to religious ones. What had once been a movement of communities loosely connected by shared stories became an authoritarian institution with sharp boundaries and punishments for crossing them. From that moment on, religion was no longer just about belief. It was about obedience. One of the most revealing aspects of the council is how little evidence there is of divine clarity. If God were truly guiding the process, you might expect a clear and lasting resolution. Instead, the aftermath was chaos. Within a few decades, the empire was still divided between Nicene Christians and Arians. Entire regions, especially among the Germanic tribes who later entered the empire, adopted Arian Christianity rather than the Nicene version. Emperors after Constantine repeatedly called new councils to settle disputes, often reversing previous decisions. At one point, the majority of bishops in the Eastern Empire rejected the Nicene Creed. If the council had really revealed eternal truth, how could it be overturned and debated so many times in the years that followed? What this shows is that theology was not discovered, but negotiated, rewritten depending on who held power. It is also striking to note the role of violence and coercion. Christianity before Constantine had been marked by persecution at the hands of Roman authorities. After Nicaea, the tables turned. Now Christians persecuted other Christians. Those who clung to different interpretations were harassed, silenced, or expelled. The same empire that once tried to stamp out Christianity now used Christianity to stamp out dissent. This transformation exposes a truth often hidden in religious history. The persecuted can quickly become persecutors when they gain power. Nicaea was the pivot where the faith of martyrs began to evolve into the machinery of an empire. The council's political nature also explains why some issues were deliberately avoided. For example, the question of which writings should be considered scripture was left unresolved. Different Christian communities at the time used different texts. Some included gospels that later disappeared, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. But Constantine and the bishops did not tackle this at Nicaea. Why? Because settling that issue would have created even more conflict at a time when the emperor was desperate for unity. The decision to delay the canon shows again that what mattered was not truth, but stability. The selection of the Bible as we know it today would take place gradually in later councils, also shaped by politics. But Nicaea laid the foundation by showing that such decisions could and should be made through centralized authority. Another overlooked element of the council is the way it helped create a new class of religious officials whose power rivaled that of traditional political leaders. Before Nicaea, bishops were local figures, respected in their cities but without universal authority. After Nicaea, the bishops who aligned with Constantine gained prestige on an imperial scale. Their signatures on the Creed made them partners in shaping empire-wide policy. Religion and politics fused into a single structure, and that structure would dominate medieval Europe. The Pope, the Patriarch, the councils, the creeds, all of these institutions trace their origins back to the moment when Constantine decided that faith should be organized like a branch of government. The Creed of Nicaea also introduced a new idea, that correct belief was more important than ethical behavior. Before the council, Christian communities often emphasized moral living, charity, humility, care for the poor. After Nicaea, the dividing line became doctrinal precision. What mattered most was whether you affirmed the correct words about Jesus' divinity. A kind person with the wrong beliefs could be condemned, while a corrupt bishop with the right beliefs could be celebrated. This shift had profound consequences. It turned religion into an intellectual test of loyalty rather than a way of life. It encouraged endless disputes about definitions and formulas, while often neglecting the lived ethics that had once attracted people to the movement. Looking at Constantine's motives helps explain why this change was so useful for the empire. Ethics can challenge power. A religion that emphasizes justice and compassion might critique the brutality of emperors and elites. But a religion that emphasizes correct belief above all else is easier to control. Once the creed was established, loyalty to the emperor could be measured by loyalty to the creed. To question one was to question the other. By prioritizing belief over behavior, Constantine created a religion that served the needs of the state far more than the needs of the people. It is worth noting that Constantine was not the first ruler to use religion for political ends. Pharaohs in Egypt claimed divinity to legitimize their rule. Roman emperors before him had been worshipped as gods. But Constantine's innovation was subtler. Instead of declaring himself divine, he took control of a growing religion and reshaped it. By doing so, he harnessed the power of faith without having to claim godhood himself. He positioned himself as the protector of the church, the guarantor of orthodoxy, and the enforcer of unity. This gave him a unique kind of legitimacy. To oppose Constantine was not only to oppose the emperor, but to risk being branded a heretic. Political loyalty and religious conformity became two sides of the same coin. The long-term results of this political manipulation are still visible today. The Nicene Creed is recited in churches around the world as if it represents timeless truth. But its origins are rooted in compromise, politics, and imperial ambition. That does not diminish its influence. It shaped Western civilization for centuries. But it does reveal the human and political forces behind doctrines often presented as divine. Understanding Nicaea forces us to question how much of what is called truth in religion is really the product of negotiation, exclusion, and power struggles. If an emperor and a council of bishops could decide the nature of God by vote, how different is that from any other political assembly deciding the rules of society? The council also marked the beginning of an unfortunate pattern: the belief that truth can be enforced through authority, rather than discovered through inquiry. Instead of allowing ideas to compete freely, Nicaea established the principle that a council backed by power could settle questions once and for all. That principle would lead to centuries of inquisitions, book burnings, and persecution. It also discouraged intellectual exploration. Once a creed was fixed, questioning it became dangerous. This stifled creativity and diversity, narrowing human thought within rigid boundaries. The same empire that had once thrived on the diversity of Greek philosophy and Roman law now began to suppress diversity in the name of orthodoxy. There is also something deeply revealing in how quickly Christian leaders accepted imperial intervention. For a movement that had once prided itself on resisting worldly power, the eagerness of bishops to align with Constantine shows how tempting power can be. Instead of resisting the emperor's control, most welcomed it, because it gave them resources, prestige, and influence they had never enjoyed before. The price of that alliance was independence. After Nicaea, the church could no longer fully claim to be a community apart from the state. It had become an institution intertwined with imperial politics, and that entanglement shaped its history from then on. The Council of Nicaea also reveals how malleable religious memory can be. Later generations came to see the council as a triumph of unity, a moment when the church spoke with one voice under divine guidance. But the reality was far more fractured. The records show heated arguments, bitter rivalries, and even reports of physical altercations among bishops. Some accounts say Arius was shouted down and humiliated. Others claim that Nicholas of Myra, the later inspiration for Santa Claus, struck Arius in the face during debate. Whether that detail is fact or legend, it reflects the intensity of the conflict. This was not calm discussion, but fierce struggle, shaped by ambition and fear of imperial displeasure. And yet centuries later, the messiness was smoothed over into a story of harmony. The politics were forgotten, the disputes erased, and the narrative reshaped into a tale of divine order. This selective memory is one of religion's enduring strategies, recasting political compromise as sacred revelation. The fact that Christianity even needed a council of this scale tells us something important. If the truth of God were clear and self-evident, why would bishops need to meet under imperial authority to decide it? The very existence of Nicaea demonstrates that early Christianity was anything but uniform. There were too many versions, too many conflicting stories, too many interpretations. Constantine's solution was to narrow the range of acceptable belief to a single formula. That was not the discovery of truth, but the elimination of alternatives. And once those alternatives were labeled heresy, they were not just marginalized, but actively erased from history. The books burned, the teachers silenced, the communities dissolved. All of this ensured that later generations would only see the version of Christianity that won imperial approval. It is telling that the bishops at Nicaea were not representative of all Christian communities. Most came from the eastern provinces of the empire, where Christianity was strongest. The Western Church, still smaller at the time, sent only a handful of representatives. Communities farther afield, such as those in North Africa or beyond the empire's borders, were not meaningfully represented at all. Yet the creed that emerged was imposed universally, as though it had been the voice of all Christians everywhere. This shows how power shapes legitimacy. A small group, backed by the emperor, claimed authority over a movement far larger and more diverse than themselves. From then on, truth was no longer what the majority of Christians believed, but what the state-enforced elite declared to be true. The council also reflected Constantine's skill as a political operator. He presented himself as a neutral facilitator, but in reality, he steered the process. He gave opening speeches urging unity. He entertained bishops in his palace, and he pushed for a resolution that would end conflict quickly. He did not leave the outcome to chance. Constantine understood that an empire needs clear symbols of unity, and he wanted the church to provide them. His role at Nicaea was not spiritual, but pragmatic. He acted like a statesman, managing factions, brokering deals, and applying pressure where needed. In doing so, he demonstrated how religion could be subordinated to political needs. And once that precedent was set, later, emperors and kings would follow it repeatedly. The politics of Nicaea extended beyond theology into practical matters. The council also addressed issues like the date of Easter. Different communities celebrated the holiday at different times, leading to confusion and division. By standardizing the date, Constantine aimed to impose uniformity. This might seem like a minor issue, but it shows the same principle. Religion was being reshaped to serve political stability. Unity in worship was seen as essential to unity in the empire. A fractured calendar could lead to fractured loyalty, so even the timing of festivals became a matter of imperial concern. Once again, faith was molded not by revelation, but by the needs of governance. One of the most profound consequences of the council was the invention of heresy as a permanent category. Before Nicaea, disagreements existed, but there was no single central authority to declare one side orthodox and the other heretical. After Nicaea, that changed. Orthodoxy and heresy became political tools, with the creed as the dividing line. This new framework allowed rulers and bishops to label opponents not just as mistaken, but as dangerous enemies of the faith. That label justified suppression, exile, or even execution. Heresy became a crime against both God and empire, a category that would haunt history for centuries. From inquisitions to witch trials, the roots trace back to the precedent set at Nicaea. Truth defined by decree, enforced by power. It is also significant that the Creed of Nicaea focused so heavily on defining Jesus' divinity, but said almost nothing about his teachings. The Sermon on the Mount, the parables, the ethical instructions, none of these were at the heart of the debate. Instead, the Creed concentrated on metaphysical claims about Jesus' relationship to God. This emphasis reveals the shift in priorities. Religion was less about guiding behavior and more about enforcing agreement on abstract definitions. That suited the needs of empire. Ethics might inspire resistance to injustice, but metaphysical formulas could be used as loyalty tests. By reducing faith to assent to a creed, Constantine turned religion into a tool for identifying insiders and outsiders. It became a badge of allegiance rather than a guide to living. When later historians describe the council, they often highlight the grandeur of the event. Hundreds of bishops gathered, imperial pageantry, solemn declarations. But behind the spectacle, the reality was stark. Truth was being manufactured under political pressure. Decisions were being made not because one argument was more convincing, but because one faction had imperial backing. Even the choice of wording in the creed was shaped by calculation, vague enough to allow broad agreement, but sharp enough to exclude Arius. That balancing act was not theology. It was politics. And yet, the outcome would be treated as holy for centuries. The aftermath of Nicaea also shows how little the council solved. Instead of ending disputes, it deepened them. Within a few years, Arianism continued to spread, especially among bishops in the eastern provinces. Constantine himself, eager to keep peace, shifted his stance and allowed some exiled Arians to return. His sons, who ruled after him, favored Arian sympathies at various points. The empire lurched back and forth between Nicene and Arian positions for decades. Councils were called again and again to restate, revise, or overturn decisions. This constant instability proves that the Creed of Nicaea was not the final word of God, but the opening shot in a long political struggle. The so-called eternal truth kept changing depending on who sat on the throne. There is also the irony of Constantine's own life. Though he shaped the course of Christian doctrine, he delayed baptism until his deathbed. For most of his reign, he participated in pagan ceremonies and honored traditional Roman gods. His conversion, while politically useful, was never wholehearted. This raises an unsettling point. The man most responsible for defining the central doctrines of Christianity may not have believed them in the way later generations imagined. His use of religion was instrumental, not devotional. Yet his decisions left a legacy that believers today still treat as sacred. That contradiction exposes the human foundations of doctrines often claimed to be divine. If you consider the broader picture, the Council of Nicaea fits a familiar pattern in history. When religions grow, they attract the attention of rulers. What begins as a grassroots movement often ends up absorbed into the machinery of state. Leaders recognize that faith can unify populations, legitimize authority, and suppress dissent. In exchange for patronage and protection, religious leaders agree to align with political power. Nicaea was simply one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of this process. The doctrines crafted there were less about divine mysteries than about the practical work of empire building. Over time, the story of Nicaea was retold as if it were a triumph of faith. But if you peel back the layers, what you see is a political negotiation disguised as theology. The emperor needed unity. The bishops wanted power. Together, they crafted a formula that served both. The creed that emerged was not timeless truth, but a historical artifact, shaped by fear of division, ambition, and imperial strategy. Its survival into modern worship is less evidence of divine origin than of the enduring power of political decisions made long ago. An understanding that history reminds us of a deeper truth. What people call eternal faith is often the product of very temporary political needs. The Council of Nicaea also marks a turning point in how religion became entangled with law. Before Constantine, Christians lived under Roman law, but outside of its favor. After Nicaea, Roman law and Christian doctrine began to intertwine. Heresy, once simply disagreement, became a crime. Exile and confiscation of property were the punishments for those who resisted the creed. That meant theology was no longer a matter of conscience. It was a matter of legal obligation. This integration of belief and law gave rulers extraordinary leverage over their subjects. Loyalty to the state could be tested by loyalty to doctrine. That kind of control had no precedent in earlier pagan religions, where diversity of worship was usually tolerated as long as political loyalty remained intact. Christianity, after Nicaea, became uniquely intolerant because belief itself had been turned into a legal boundary. The way Constantine managed the council also reveals the mechanics of empire. He convened more than 300 bishops, but they were not free citizens meeting as equals. They were his guests, housed at imperial expense, dependent on his hospitality. Their travel costs were paid by the state. They dined at banquets hosted by the emperor himself. These gestures created a subtle dependency. Bishops knew that their careers, their safety, even their very survival, depended on Constantine's goodwill. In such an atmosphere, how free could their deliberations really be? The council was less a gathering of independent thinkers than an orchestrated assembly in which dissent carried real risks. The creed that emerged was signed not because every bishop was persuaded, but because few dared to openly defy the emperor who held the power of life, death, and exile. Another revealing element is how the council erased the diversity of Jesus' image. Before Nicaea, different communities held very different views of who he was. Some saw him as a prophet, others as a teacher of wisdom, others as a cosmic redeemer. The Gospels themselves reflect that diversity, with John presenting a very different figure than Mark. At Nicaea, that diversity was collapsed into a single official version. Jesus as fully divine, equal to the Father, eternal and uncreated. That definition excluded all other understandings. The richness of early Christianity, its debates and experiments, was narrowed down into one formula that would be enforced with state power. The cost of unity was the loss of diversity. That narrowing is still felt today, as centuries of alternative voices were silenced in the name of orthodoxy. What is striking is how easily political language and theological language blurred at the council. When bishops declared Jesus of the same substance as the Father, they were also declaring their own unity under the emperor's rule. When they condemned Arius, they were not just resolving a theological dispute. They were signaling loyalty to Constantine's vision of a unified empire. Theology and politics fused into one, with each reinforcing the other. That fusion meant that religious dissent became indistinguishable from political rebellion. It also meant that the Church could no longer claim independence from worldly power. Its doctrines were crafted in council halls under imperial oversight, not discovered in prayer or revelation. The way the council treated Arius himself is also telling. He was not allowed to continue teaching freely after the council. His books were ordered burned, and he was exiled. These measures were not acts of theological persuasion, but of censorship and suppression. By trying to erase Arius, the council showed its true nature as an instrument of power. If the creed had truly been self-evident, why resort to force? The resort to exile and book burning reveals the insecurity of the settlement. Truth that must be enforced by burning books and silencing voices is not truth. It is control. And that control served the needs of Constantine's empire far more than the search for spiritual insight. The long aftermath of Nicaea demonstrates how fragile political settlements and religion can be. For decades after 325, the empire was torn by theological disputes. Different emperors favored different sides. Councils were called to revise or reaffirm the Nicene formula. Bishops were exiled and reinstated depending on who was in power. Whole regions swung between Nicene and Arian sympathies. This constant instability shows that the council was never about discovering truth, but about enforcing temporary consensus. And yet, over time, the Nicene position became entrenched, not because it was inherently truer, but because it eventually gained the backing of the most enduring structures of power. Orthodoxy triumphed not by reason, but by persistence and enforcement. Looking at Nicaea in the wider context of Roman history makes its political character even clearer. The Roman Empire had always thrived by absorbing local religions into its system. Conquered peoples were usually allowed to keep their gods, as long as they also honored the emperor and Roman rituals. Christianity was different because it refused compromise. By the early 4th century, its growth had made it impossible to ignore. Constantine's genius was not to destroy it, but to harness it. The council was his way of turning a fragmented movement into a unified institution loyal to him. Instead of many sects pulling in different directions, he created a single orthodoxy that could serve as the religious backbone of the empire. In doing so, he transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority into the imperial faith. But that transformation came at the cost of its independence. The very choice of the word creed is revealing. The Creed of Nicaea was a statement that had to be recited, memorized, and affirmed. It turned faith into a formula, a set of words repeated as proof of loyalty. This mechanization of belief made it easier for the state to test conformity. Believers were no longer free to interpret stories or teachings in their own ways. They had to affirm the exact words crafted in council. That requirement stripped faith of flexibility and turned it into obedience. The recitation of the creed was less about understanding and more about proving allegiance. It is no accident that political systems across history have used similar pledges, oaths, and slogans to enforce unity. The Nicene Creed was essentially the empire's loyalty oath, framed in theological language. There is also something deeply symbolic in the way Constantine presented himself at the council. He entered dressed in imperial robes, dazzling with gold and jewels, seated on a throne as the bishops rose to honor him. This was not the image of a humble servant of God, but of a ruler claiming ultimate authority. By presiding over the council, Constantine placed himself above the bishops, above the disputes, even above the doctrines being debated. He positioned himself as the arbiter of truth, even though he was not a theologian. That symbolism mattered. It showed that from now on, the emperor was the final judge of religious truth. The merging of throne and altar was made visible in that hall at Nicaea, and the consequences would echo for centuries. The council also left unresolved tensions that would shape the future of Christianity. While it declared Jesus equal to the Father, it said little about the Holy Spirit. That question would erupt later in new disputes, leading to further councils. The incomplete nature of the Nicene formula shows how theology was being built piece by piece, adjusted as political needs changed. It was never a single moment of revelation, but a series of negotiations, each one adding or revising doctrines. This incremental process exposes the human hand in what is often presented as divine truth. Doctrines were not delivered whole from heaven. They were patched together through debate, compromise, and decree. If you follow the story further, the council's precedent shaped medieval and modern history in profound ways. The idea that councils could define truth became standard. The idea that rulers could enforce belief through law became unquestioned. The suppression of heresy became routine. Libraries were destroyed, thinkers silenced, and alternative traditions erased, all justified by the logic born at Nicaea. Even wars were fought over definitions of God that had been crafted in council chambers centuries earlier. The violence of later centuries cannot be separated from the political decisions made in that hall in 325. What began as an attempt to unify an empire turned into a template for centuries of religious control. Looking back, the most profound lesson of Nicaea is how fragile the boundary is between belief and politics. Doctrines that billions treat as sacred today were once the subject of messy debates, imperial calculations, and forced compromises. What is recited as eternal truth was once hammered out under pressure, influenced as much by fear of division as by any search for meaning. The Council of Nicaea reminds us that what people call faith is often built not in moments of revelation, but in the rough work of politics. It is not eternal wisdom, but the product of human hands, human ambition, and human power. One of the overlooked consequences of the council is how it permanently shifted the balance between faith and empire. After Nicaea, it was clear that the emperor had the authority to intervene in religious matters. This precedent would be repeated again and again. Emperors in the centuries that followed summoned councils, enforced decrees, and even installed or deposed church leaders. The independence of the early Christian movement was gone. From then on, the church was bound to the state, and theology became another arena of imperial policy. This was a decisive break from the origins of the movement. The figure who once preached about the kingdom of God apart from earthly kingdoms had now been turned into the cornerstone of an imperial ideology. That reversal reveals how religion can be co-opted by power until it serves ends far removed from its beginnings. The political motives at play become clearer when we examine who benefited from the council. Constantine secured greater stability for his empire. Bishops who sided with him gained prestige and influence. The ordinary believer, however, gained little. Their everyday struggles remained unchanged. Famine, disease, and heavy taxation did not vanish because a creed had been signed. Yet they were now expected to recite new formulas, accept new definitions, and treat them as sacred. What this shows is that religion at the institutional level often evolves not for the sake of ordinary people, but for the sake of those in power. The creed was not designed to make life better for farmers, soldiers, or artisans. It was designed to unify an empire and strengthen a hierarchy. The use of book burnings after Nicaea also illustrates the fear behind orthodoxy. Arius's writings were ordered to be destroyed. This act of erasure was meant to prevent future generations from even knowing the full range of debates that once existed. By burning the evidence, the victors controlled the narrative. This was not the pursuit of truth, but the manufacturing of history. Today, only fragments of Arius's thoughts survive, quoted by his opponents. We cannot know his ideas in his own words, because the official church made sure they were destroyed. This silencing is a reminder that what survives as religious truth is not necessarily what was most persuasive, but what was most aggressively preserved by those with power. The council also highlights the role of language in politics. The debates over Greek terms like homoousios, of the same substance, may sound abstract, but they carried enormous weight. A single word could determine who was inside the church and who was out. Words became weapons, carefully chosen to draw boundaries and exclude rivals. That use of language as a tool of control continues in religious institutions to this day. Subtle differences in vocabulary separate denominations, movements, and communities, each insisting on the correctness of their formula. Yet when traced back, these differences often originate in political debates like those at Nicaea, where words were chosen less for their spiritual insight and more for their utility in enforcing unity. The politics behind the council also appear in how it shaped the church's relationship with violence. Before Constantine, Christians had often been pacifists, refusing to serve in the Roman army or participate in violence. After Nicaea, the church became increasingly entangled with state power, including the military. Bishops blessed imperial wars, soldiers marched under Christian banners, and killing in the name of empire became sanctified. This transformation cannot be separated from the council, where faith and empire were fused. Once the church had aligned itself with the state, it inevitably shared in the state's use of coercion and violence. The persecuted religion of the martyrs became the persecuting religion of emperors, and that pivot began in earnest at Nicaea. It is also worth examining how the council's decisions affected the intellectual life of the empire. By enforcing one version of truth, Nicaea discouraged exploration of alternatives. The diversity of thought that had once characterized early Christianity, its gospels, letters, and teachings, was narrowed. Questions that might have inspired creativity were closed off. Entire streams of thought were declared heretical and abandoned. This narrowing of intellectual life mirrors what often happens when states enforce ideology. Debate is stifled, curiosity punished, and conformity rewarded. The creed became a boundary that thinkers dared not cross. Over time, this had profound consequences for philosophy, science, and culture, as the dominance of orthodoxy discouraged inquiry in many fields. The council's legacy was not only religious control, but intellectual stagnation. Even the council's treatment of bishops who refused to comply illustrates the political nature of the event. Some who resisted were not merely exiled, but had their writings destroyed, their names condemned, their reputations ruined. These were not theological debates won by argument, but political contests won by force. The use of exile shows that the emperor's primary concern was not truth, but obedience. If an idea threatened unity, it was suppressed regardless of its merits. That principle, unity above truth, defined much of the history of the Church after Nicaea. The danger of disunity was considered greater than the danger of falsehood. In practice, this meant that whatever the emperor declared orthodoxy was treated as truth, even if many disagreed. Another revealing aspect is how the council reshaped authority within the Church. Before Nicaea, local communities often had significant independence. Bishops were respected, but not absolute. After Nicaea, the authority of bishops grew, especially those who aligned with imperial power. Over time, this led to the rise of centralized hierarchies, with patriarchs and eventually popes claiming supreme authority. The council was the first step in transforming a movement of small communities into a rigid institution governed from the top down. That institutionalization gave the Church extraordinary endurance, but also locked it into patterns of control and suppression. Religion became less about community and more about bureaucracy. The decision to declare Arius a heretic also reveals the psychology of exclusion. Once someone is labeled a heretic, they are no longer treated as a fellow believer with a different perspective. They are treated as an enemy of truth, dangerous and corrupting. That label justified harsh measures. By turning disagreements into heresy, the council ensured that future conflicts would not be resolved through dialogue but through force. The creation of heresy as a permanent category allowed the Church to police thought for centuries, punishing those who stepped outside the boundaries set by councils and rulers. This invention of heresy, born at Nicaea, was one of the most consequential political acts in religious history. The council also reveals the fragility of doctrines when tied to politics. For decades after 325, the empire seesawed between Nicene and Arian positions. Whole regions of the empire remained loyal to Arian Christianity, especially in the East. The eventual dominance of the Nicene position was not inevitable. It was the outcome of centuries of conflict, alliances, and enforcement. This shows that what many today take as eternal truth was, in fact, the result of historical accidents, political victories, and imperial power plays. If different emperors had prevailed, or if different councils had carried the day, Christianity as we know it might look completely different. The version that survived is not necessarily the truest, but simply the one that won. When viewed in this light, the Council of Nicaea becomes a case study in how power shapes belief. The emperor needed unity, the bishops needed authority, and the creed gave them both. But what it gave ordinary believers was less freedom, less diversity, and less space to think for themselves. It turned faith into conformity and dissent into crime. It recast religious life as obedience to formulas crafted in council chambers under imperial oversight. That transformation is why Nicaea is remembered, not because it discovered truth, but because it institutionalized control. The doctrines that billions still recite today carry within them the fingerprints of politics, power, and empire. The way the council is remembered also highlights the importance of storytelling in shaping faith. Later, church historians wrote accounts that portrayed Constantine as a divinely chosen instrument, presiding over a council guided by the Holy Spirit. They described the bishops as united, the creed as inspired, and the outcome as inevitable. These narratives erased the conflicts, the manipulations, and the imperial pressure that defined the event. By rewriting history, the Church turned a messy political negotiation into a sacred legend. That process of myth-making ensured that future generations would see the council not as a contest of power, but as a triumph of truth. In reality, What they inherited was a curated memory designed to legitimize authority and silence questions. The council's effects stretched far beyond theology. It changed the way authority itself was understood. By establishing that a council backed by the emperor could decide doctrine, Nicaea created a model of centralized control that influenced not only religion, but also politics. Kings, emperors, and popes would later imitate this model, gathering assemblies, declaring orthodoxy, and enforcing conformity. The very structure of medieval Europe, with its councils, decrees, and inquisitions, can be traced back to the precedent of Nicaea. What began as an attempt to unify the church became a template for governing societies through ideological control. This shows how decisions in one moment can shape entire civilizations for centuries. The economic side of the council is often overlooked but significant. By aligning the church with the emperor, bishops gained access to resources, land, and wealth. Imperial patronage flowed to those who conformed, while dissenters lost property and status. Religion became a path to power and prosperity, and loyalty to orthodoxy became a way to secure material gain. This created incentives for bishops to suppress rivals, not only out of devotion, but out of ambition. The intertwining of wealth and orthodoxy meant that religious truth was inseparable from economic interest. The Creed was not just a theological statement. It was also a ticket to imperial favor and financial security. Another political dimension of Nicaea lies in its timing. Constantine had recently consolidated his rule after years of civil war. His victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which he attributed to Christian symbols, had given him a reputation as a ruler favored by the Christian God. But his empire was still fragile, threatened by division and unrest. The council was convened only a few years later, in part to stabilize his rule. By presenting himself as the unifier of the church, Constantine also presented himself as the unifier of the empire. The council was therefore not only about theology, but about consolidating political legitimacy. It allowed Constantine to claim the role of protector of truth, cementing his authority in both the spiritual and political spheres. The treatment of Easter at the council shows how even practical issues became politicized. Different communities celebrated Easter on different dates, and this lack of uniformity troubled Constantine. To him, it was not a minor matter of ritual, but a sign of disunity. The council's decision to fix a single date for Easter was a political act disguised as a religious one. It demonstrated the empire's power to impose uniformity on diverse communities. It also showed how even the calendar could be turned into an instrument of control. Uniformity in worship was meant to mirror uniformity in politics. By synchronizing religious life, Constantine sought to synchronize loyalty to the empire itself. The very idea of creed as law reflects a profound shift in how people were expected to relate to religion. In earlier times, religious practice had been flexible, with local variations tolerated. At Nicaea, belief became standardized, and that standardization was enforced. Faith was no longer a personal or communal journey, but a matter of reciting the correct formula. This reduction of religion to conformity served the needs of empire, because it made belief measurable and enforceable. It also made dissent dangerous, because deviation from the creed was not just personal error, but public defiance. The transformation of faith into law reveals the deep political logic behind the council. The story of Nicaea also forces us to confront the problem of truth decided by vote. The bishops debated, factions argued, compromises were made, and then a majority signed the creed. That process mirrors political assemblies more than divine revelation. Eternal truth should not depend on majority rule. Yet at Nicaea, that was exactly how it was established. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of doctrine. If a few votes had gone the other way, would eternal truth look different today? If theology can be decided like a policy, then its authority comes not from heaven, but from human agreement. The Council, in this sense, reveals the human origins of what many still treat as divine. The political stakes of the Council also explain its ferocity. For Constantine, disunity in the Church was not just a theological problem, but a political threat. Religious division could inflame regional loyalties, inspire rebellion, or undermine his legitimacy. By enforcing a single creed, he was trying to neutralize that threat. But in doing so, he turned theology into a battleground of empire. Every doctrinal dispute after Nicaea carried political consequences. Bishops became political actors, heresies became crimes, and councils became imperial theaters. The fusion of religion and politics was complete, and the council was the moment it crystallized. The council also reveals how little concern there was for ordinary believers. Most Christians of the time had never heard of homoousios or Arius. They were more concerned with survival, morality, and community. But their faith was reshaped from above, by elites speaking a language they did not understand, under the direction of an emperor whose primary concern was unity. This top-down imposition alienated religion from the lived experience of ordinary people. It shows how often doctrines reflect the priorities of rulers, rather than the needs of the faithful. The creed was not the product of communities seeking meaning, but of a political system seeking stability. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of Nicaea is the idea that truth must be guarded by exclusion. By creating orthodoxy, the council also created heresy. Once heresy existed as a category, it could never be removed. Every new debate produced new heresies, new exclusions, new persecutions. The cycle of orthodoxy and heresy defined Christian history for centuries, with councils, inquisitions, and trials repeating the same pattern. That cycle began at Nicaea, when disagreement was first criminalized. In this sense, the council did not bring unity, but set in motion an endless struggle over who controlled the definition of truth. The Council of Nicaea is therefore best understood, not as a sacred event, but as a political watershed. It shows how belief can be molded by power, how truth can be manufactured through councils, and how faith can be turned into an instrument of control. The doctrines recited today as eternal were once the subject of debate, compromise, and imperial decree. To understand that is not to dismiss their importance, but to see them clearly as products of history. The council was not a revelation from God, but a negotiation among men, overseen by an emperor, driven by politics and enforced by power. That is its real legacy. What makes the politics of Nicaea even clearer is how quickly the same methods were repeated. After Constantine, later emperors used the same playbook. Convene a council, demand unity, exile dissenters, and enforce orthodoxy through law. Councils at Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon followed the same model. Each time, the debates were presented as matters of eternal truth. Yet each time, the outcome was shaped by who had the emperor's support. The very doctrines that define mainstream Christianity today, about Christ, the Trinity, the nature of the Spirit, were not the product of divine revelation, but of successive councils operating under imperial authority. This continuity proves that Nicaea was not an isolated event, but the foundation of a system in which truth was decided by political negotiation. The very fact that the creed had to be revised in later councils shows its fragility. If Nicaea had truly settled the question of Christ's nature once and for all, why did later generations need to revisit it? The answer is simple. Because the council did not discover truth. It manufactured consensus, and consensus always needs maintenance. The ongoing disputes reveal that belief was never fixed, but always subject to the shifting needs of empire. What people today call orthodox doctrine was in reality a series of temporary settlements, patched together in response to political crises. The permanence of these doctrines came not from their self-evident truth, but from centuries of enforcement by church and state. Another dimension often ignored is how the council affected relationships between East and West. At the time, the Roman Empire was still formally united, but cultural divides were already deepening. The Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West had different traditions, different theologies, and different political priorities. Nicaea attempted to bridge those divides by creating a universal formula. But in reality, it papered over differences without resolving them. The long history of conflict between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism can be traced back to these early attempts at forced unity. The council sowed seeds of division, even as it tried to impose unity, because it showed that theology would always be decided at the intersection of culture, politics, and imperial power. The exclusion of alternative texts and traditions is another key consequence. By narrowing orthodoxy, Nicaea helped accelerate the process of canon formation. Texts that supported the Nicene view were elevated, while those that did not quietly disappeared. Gospels that presented Jesus differently, more human, more mystical, or less divine, were marginalized. Over time, these texts were lost altogether, surviving only in fragments discovered centuries later. The result is that the version of Christianity that dominates today is not the only one that ever existed, but the one that survived the political purge that began at Nicaea. When people read the Bible today, they are reading a curated collection shaped by centuries of councils and exclusions. That process began when Constantine and his bishops decided that unity was more important than diversity. The council also highlights the psychological dimension of power. By forcing bishops to sign the creed, Constantine created not only external conformity, but internal loyalty. To sign a document under the gaze of the emperor was to bind oneself publicly to his authority. Once bishops had signed, they could not easily retreat without risking disgrace or punishment. This use of public declaration as a loyalty test is a classic political strategy. It turns belief into a matter of performance, where individuals must demonstrate allegiance through visible acts. The creed was not simply about belief in God. It was about showing obedience to the emperor's chosen solution. This intertwining of faith and obedience became one of the most enduring features of state religion. There is also the matter of how Nicaea reshaped the image of Jesus himself. By declaring him of the same substance as the Father, the council elevated him into a metaphysical figure far removed from the teacher who walked in Galilee. The human Jesus, the preacher of parables, the friend of outcasts, was overshadowed by the cosmic Christ, eternal and uncreated. This shift served imperial needs. A divine Christ could serve as a symbol of unity and authority in a way that a human teacher could not. The elevation of Jesus into a metaphysical being was not only theology, it was politics. It turned him into a figure that could anchor an empire, not just a movement. And in doing so, it transformed Christianity into something very different from its origins. The council's political nature is also clear when you consider how its decisions were enforced. Arius and his followers were not persuaded. They were silenced. Exile, suppression, and the destruction of writings ensured that only one voice survived. This was not the search for truth, but the imposition of conformity. It was the same logic that empires had always used to suppress rebellion, now applied to theology. Heresy was treated like treason, and the same tools of punishment were used. This blending of religious dissent with political crime gave rulers extraordinary power. From then on, to disagree with doctrine was to defy the state, and that made religion a perfect instrument of control. The use of councils to enforce conformity also reveals the fragility of empire itself. Constantine knew that Rome was vulnerable. Civil wars had weakened it, invasions threatened it, and loyalty was fragile. Religion offered a way to hold it together, but only if it could be unified. The council was a desperate measure to stabilize a crumbling world. That context explains why unity mattered more than truth. For Constantine, the empire's survival was at stake, and if that meant forcing bishops to agree on a creed, then so be it. The creed was less a theological document than a political bandage on a wounded empire. Its survival into modern times is a testament not to its truth, but to its usefulness. When you trace the legacy of Nicaea, you find it everywhere in the history of Christianity. The idea that truth can be defined by councils, the criminalization of dissent as heresy, the fusion of church and state, the elevation of doctrine above ethics, the narrowing of scripture to fit orthodoxy. All of these patterns begin at Nicaea. It was not just a council. It was the blueprint for a system that would dominate Europe for centuries. Every time a heretic was burned, every time a book was banned, every time a creed was enforced, the shadow of Nicaea was present. It was the moment when religion stopped being a movement of diverse communities and became an arm of political power. The irony is that many who recite the Nicene Creed today are unaware of this history. They speak the words as if they were ancient truths revealed from above. But those words were the product of debate, compromise, and imperial decree. They carry within them the fingerprints of emperors and bishops, of political calculations and cultural struggles. To recognize this is not to dismiss their importance, but to see them clearly. The creed is not timeless. It is historical. It is the record of a political decision made in a fragile empire nearly 2,000 years ago, still echoing in the present. One of the most revealing outcomes of the council is how it permanently redefined the role of power in shaping truth. After Nicaea, it was no longer possible to separate theology from politics. Every doctrinal debate became a political contest. Every theological disagreement carried the weight of imperial loyalty. Faith itself was absorbed into the machinery of governance. This meant that the central doctrines of Christianity were not the result of free inquiry or communal discernment, but of imperial strategy. They were products of the state, manufactured for stability, enforced by law, and justified through selective memory. The council was not only a religious milestone, but a political innovation. It created a model where belief could be standardized like law, loyalty could be tested by creed, and dissent could be punished as treason. The irony is that the council, meant to unify, also sowed the seeds of endless division. By drawing sharp boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy, it ensured that future disagreements would become explosive. Every new debate created new heresies, new exiles, new persecutions. Instead of ending disputes, Nicaea institutionalized them. Once the pattern was set, history followed it again and again. Disputes over the Spirit, disputes over Mary, disputes over icons, disputes over papal authority. Each one followed the template of Nicaea. Convene a council, declare one side orthodox, label the other heretical, and enforce the decision with power. This cycle reveals the cost of turning faith into law. Once belief becomes a legal obligation, difference becomes rebellion, and the struggle for control never ends. The council also reminds us of the fragility of religious memory. The story that survived about Nicaea is one of harmony, triumph, and divine inspiration. The reality was conflict, compromise, and imperial coercion. What we know about Arius, for example, comes mostly from his enemies, because his own writings were destroyed. What we know about the debates comes through the lens of later historians who were loyal to orthodoxy. The losers of history were erased, and with them, much of the richness of early Christianity. The religion that emerged was not the full spectrum of belief, but the narrow version chosen by power. This selective memory is a political act in itself. By shaping what is remembered, rulers shaped what is believed. The council is therefore not only an event, but an example of how history is written by those who win. The broader lesson of Nicaea is that religions are never immune to politics. No matter how sacred the language, no matter how eternal the claims, the realities of power, control, and ambition shape outcomes. The Council of 325 shows this with particular clarity. A religion in turmoil was harnessed by an empire in crisis. Doctrines were hammered out not by revelation, but by debate under pressure. Creeds were signed not in freedom, but under imperial gaze. Dissent was not refuted, but silenced. And yet, the results of that process are still treated as sacred by billions. This gap between origins and perception is one of the most important truths that history reveals. What is called eternal often has its roots in temporary political needs. If you look closely at the creed itself, you can see the fingerprints of the council's priorities. It spends far more time defining Jesus' relationship to the Father than it does describing how to live. It is a statement designed not to guide ethical life, but to enforce doctrinal conformity. It does not teach compassion, justice, or charity. It teaches allegiance to a definition of divinity. That focus reflects the priorities of Constantine and his bishops. They were not interested in shaping behavior. They were interested in shaping loyalty. The creed was less a moral compass than a loyalty test, less a guide to life than a boundary of inclusion and exclusion. Its survival shows how successful that strategy was. People still recite it today, often without realizing that its origin lies not in spiritual insight, but in political necessity. The council also demonstrates how power thrives on simplicity. Before Nicaea, Christianity was diverse, complex, and sometimes contradictory. After Nicaea, it was given a simple formula. Jesus is of the same substance as the Father, eternal and divine. That simplicity was politically powerful. It gave rulers a clear standard to enforce, and believers a clear badge to display. But simplicity often comes at the cost of truth. Complex realities were reduced to formulas, nuanced beliefs were erased, and diversity was outlawed. The council's success lay in its ability to impose a single, simple definition on a complex reality. That is the hallmark of politics, not revelation. The reduction of complexity into a formula that can be enforced. The legacy of Nicaea can also be seen in the way later rulers used religion to suppress dissent. Once the idea was accepted that councils could define truth and the state could enforce it, the door was opened for centuries of control. Heretics, reformers, and critics were silenced not because their ideas were untrue, but because they threatened unity. From the persecution of Arians to the Inquisition, the logic was the same. Truth is what the council says it is, and to resist is to rebel. This logic began at Nicaea, where for the first time, truth was crafted under imperial authority and enforced by imperial power. Every later act of religious repression carries its shadow. The Council of Nicaea also shows how religion can be transformed by its alliance with empire. Before Constantine, Christianity had been marginal, often persecuted, and largely outside the structures of power. After Nicaea, it became the religion of the empire, intertwined with its politics, wealth, and violence. This alliance changed the character of the faith. It lost much of its independence, much of its diversity, and much of its ethical focus. In exchange, it gained power, stability, and global reach. That bargain defined its future. The cost of empire was conformity, and Nicaea was the price paid. It was the moment when faith was reshaped into an institution, no longer the voice of a movement, but the arm of a state. In the end, The politics behind the Council of Nicaea matter because they reveal how fragile the line is between truth and power. Doctrines that billions recite as eternal were once the subject of political debate. Creeds treated as sacred were once the tools of imperial control. The decisions of a few hundred bishops, guided by the ambitions of a single emperor, became the foundation of a religion that still shapes the world. To understand that history is to see religion not as something outside human affairs, but as deeply embedded within them. Nicaea was not a divine revelation, but a political invention. Its legacy is a reminder that what people call eternal truth is often the echo of ancient politics, still reverberating in the present.